Welcome to the new Transatlantic Cable, a tripartite civil engineering history webinar series. The webinars are coordinated by the History and Heritage Committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National History Committee of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and the Panel for Historical Engineering Works of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Today's installment, recorded on January 29th, 2025, features Lawrence M. Larry Magura presenting Crystal Springs Dam, the oldest mass concrete dam in the world.
Welcome, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. I'm Gordon Masterton, Chair of the Institution of Civil Engineers Panel of Historical Engineering Works, and I'll be your host for today's tripartite New Transatlantic Cable Civil Engineering History webinar. First of all, a word from me about the webinar program. Then we'll announce our first code word for those looking for CPD points. Now, the ACE and the CSCE and the ICE, they're three learned societies created to develop and maintain high standards of civil engineering practice. And the intent of the tripartite New Transatlantic Cable History webinar is to enhance interaction between the societies and our members and recognize civil engineering history crosses international boundaries. The talks by default have to be on topics that involve at least two out of the three participating societies. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter tonight, Larry Magura. Larry's a semi-retired water resources engineer who earned an undergraduate degree from Davis University, holds two master's degrees, one's not enough, from Berkeley, one in civil engineering, water resources, and one in watershed management. He's a licensed professional engineer in Oregon, Washington, and California. It's pretty much all the West Coast, Larry, and holds national certification as a water resources engineer from the American Academy of Water Resources Engineers. He was elected by the ASCE Board of Direction to the grade of Fellow in 2017. He served as president of the Oregon section of the ASCE and just finished a 3-year term as a society director for Region 8, Western US and Canada minus California. And Larry is also an active member of the ASCE's History and Heritage Committee, and in that capacity, he coordinated successful efforts to get Crystal Springs Dam in San Mateo, California, you'll be hearing all about it, listed as a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark in December 2023. Larry, the floor is yours. Please proceed.
Thank you for that introduction, Gordon, and thank you all for joining this discussion today about Crystal Springs Dam. A little bit of a background. This is a presentation I prepared for the ASCE National Convention in Tampa, Florida last October. And as a sitting board member at the time, I was in Tampa for a board meeting. And I remember coming down for the morning of the second day of our board meeting, and our national director, Tom Smith, was huddled with several people, and they had grim looks on their faces. And they had realized that Hurricane Milton was bearing down on Tampa. And they pulled the plug at that point and said, we have to cancel, for the first time in the 170-year history of ASCE, a national convention. And so that created great consternation. We were sped on our way when the manager of the hotel in downtown Tampa put notes on our rooms saying this hotel will be evacuated in 12 hours. So I came back with this presentation. I've delivered it a couple of times to local groups in Oregon, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to present it to a wider audience here. And at the time in last October, when I prepared these slides, the title of the talk was Crystal Springs Dam, the oldest mass concrete dam in the world, in the U.S. and maybe in the world, in parentheses. Based on further discussions with Gordon Masterton, I think we can take away the and maybe in the world. I believe it is in the world now. And that has been the position of the ASCE History and Heritage Committee for a while since we got into this process. But my learning objectives are to teach about the history of how Crystal Springs Dam came to be designed and built, the role of engineer Herman Schuessler in designing and building the dam, and What makes Crystal Springs Dam unique? Well, there's several factors to do that. And I'll wrap it up with a brief presentation of how the Crystal Springs Dam became designated as an ASCE National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark. Here is Crystal Springs Dam as it looks today. About 10 years ago, Kiewit Corporation on the West Coast put a new spillway on the dam here. And that's the first modification since the dam was completed in the 1890s. This is the reservoir behind it. And right about where my cursor is moving here is where the San Andreas Fault is located, which is interesting. Another location here is the dam. And if anybody ever wants to visit the dam, do not rely on the directions you'll get through Google. You're going to end up in a parking lot at a golf course. I was born and raised in San Francisco, grew up in the peninsula right in this area here, attended Hillsdale High School. And by the time I was a teenager, me and my chums would love to go hiking. And we hiked up to Crystal Springs Dam on a couple of occasions and would slip under the barbed wire fence and stand out on top of the dam, which at the base, it's 145 feet above the bed of the stream. And that was when I first became interested in the dam. And then years later, when I became a member of the History and Heritage Committee, through some oversight, I discovered that the dam had never been honored by ASCE's National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark Program. And so I prepared the application, which was accepted by the History and Heritage Committee, and wrote this article, which appeared a year ago in the March-April 2024 issue of Civil Engineering Magazine. The editor-in-chief gave it a sexier title than I would have come up with, A Concrete Dam for the Ages, and there's an historic photograph there. And so this presentation builds on the research I did for both the application and the writing of the article, but it includes some things that I didn't have time to talk about before. So here's an 1876 map prepared by the Spring Valley Water Company, which was the owner and the builder of the dam. And you can see the relationship of Crystal Springs Dam to San Francisco. It's about 15 miles south on the peninsula. And in those days, in the 1870s, San Francisco, the western part of it was all sand dunes. It's now called the North Beach area. Here's the Golden Gate here, long before the Golden Gate Bridge was built. San Francisco was by far the largest city on the West Coast in the 1860s, 1870s. The second largest city was Sacramento, which is much smaller. And number 3 was my hometown now, Portland, Oregon. LA was just an afterthought. It was just a small town in those days. Always had a Mediterranean climate. It's only 46 square miles of surface area in the city of San Francisco. There's no large local watershed available within the city limits to supply water, and so water was always a critically short quantity. They had several devastating fires in the early years of the city because it was built primarily out of wood. They gradually turned to more durable materials, brick and concrete. There were some surface springs, but in those days, people would capture water at the springs and put it in barrels and drive horse-drawn wagons up and down Market Street selling water. So Spring Valley Water Company was created in 1858 to solve the problem. Here's an early view. This is from the 1890s of what San Francisco looked like in the early days. And in this view, here's the City Hall, which was brand new in those days, was destroyed in the 2006 earthquake and fire. Let's talk about Hermann Schussler. Born in 1842 in Germany, he had a formal engineering education in Zurich and Karlsruhe. And he arrived in San Francisco in May of 1864 at the ripe old age of about 22, turning 23. He spoke no English when he left Germany, but by the time he completed his journey across the Atlantic and across the newly completed Panama Isthmus Railroad and up the West Coast, he had learned a fair amount of English through talking with the crew and reading magazines. So that's a great way to learn a new language. When he arrived in San Francisco in May 1864, he was hired a couple months later by the Spring Valley Water Company at an initial salary of $50 a month. And he worked on various small reservoir projects in San Mateo County up until 1866, when obviously his brilliance and his attachment to the board of direction for Spring Valley, they promoted him to chief engineer. And that's a title he maintained until he retired in 1919. He was an ASCE member, but that was later in his career that he joined. And he died in San Francisco in April 1929, a few months before the great stock market crash, Black Tuesday. In the course of his work in San Mateo County, he did all this on horseback. He found an ideal dam site for a large, high dam in the 1870s. And he eventually convinced the board of directors of Spring Valley to quietly acquire as much land in the vicinity of the dam site as possible. And the board thought this was a good thing to do. They wanted to maintain their monopoly, and they also needed to serve the needs of a growing city. So they dispatched agents into the valley to acquire property from willing sellers, make you an offer you can't refuse, or whatever that equivalent was in 1870s. And by the early 1880s, Spring Valley had acquired clear title to over 23,000 acres in the area. That's over 10,000 hectares, virtually the entire watershed. And so serious planning for the high dam began in the mid-1880s. And at that time, there were only 17 dams in the world that exceeded 95 feet in height. None of them were in the U.S. Schuessler wanted to build a dam up to 145 feet in height to maximize the storage capacity that he had available at this excellent dam site. He wanted to make the structure out of stone masonry, which was considered state-of-the-art in the 1880s. But he lacked a good local source of stone, good competent stone. This area is all part of what's called the Franciscan Formation, which is a melange of many different types of rock, but none of them were judged suitable for dam construction. It's interesting to note that although the site had favorable geology, Schuessler was an engineer. He had no specific knowledge that we can find in his surviving notes and things. They had any awareness of the proximity of the dam site to the San Andreas Fault. Schuessler rapidly pivoted from stone to mass concrete as his primary material for dam construction. And apparently he did that without a clear understanding of where he's going to get the Portland cement, because in those days, there was no large-scale Portland cement industry in the United States in the 1880s. It had to be ordered and imported from the J.B. White and Brothers in Swanscombe, England, and shipped in watertight oak barrels. It had to be shipped a long way. And this shipping it by water was really the only option other than getting across the Atlantic Ocean, because although there were two transcontinental railroads by this time in the United States, they were dedicated to hauling passengers and high-value freight and were not set up to transport large quantities of bulk materials. So these materials were transported by ship, a distance from Portland to San Francisco of about 16,000 nautical miles. Although the dam access is located only 1,100 feet east of the trace of the San Andreas Fault, again, Schuessler had no specific knowledge about this. The first description of the San Andreas Fault was published by University of California, Berkeley geology professor Andrew Lawson in 1895, 5 years after Crystal Springs Dam was completed. And there are no records of any previous movement on the San Andreas Fault north of the Tehachapi Mountains since Spanish colonization of California in the 1770s. The first movement in the northern section of the fault occurred on April 18, 1906, which destroyed San Francisco. It's interesting to note that the dam received no damage from either the 1906 earthquake or the nearly as damaging 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. And it is inspected every 2 years by the California Division of Dam Safety, and it's always passed with high marks. You can see here, the orange line here is the location of the San Andreas Fault, and our dam is located right here on my cursor. It's a very active fault zone, and there will be more movements along it in the years to come. I think they're up to a 62% probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater coming up in the next 40 years. So how do they transport Portland cement to the dam site? Well, they use clipper ship Cutty Sark as a typical example. It's the world's last surviving clipper ship, actually. They were the typical bulk haulers of the 1880s. Steamships that were coming online were very popular, of course, but you could never carry something on a steamship 16,000 nautical miles. You couldn't possibly carry enough coal to keep it going. And steamships were mostly confined to the transatlantic trade in those days. And so many voyages of using clipper ships were required to deliver the quantity of materials needed, which I'll talk about that in a minute, to the dam site. And again, here's the British Isles here. They went completely across the Atlantic, around South America, up the West Coast to San Francisco, 16,000 approximately nautical miles. These are the board of directors in 1888 of the Spring Valley Water Company. And you can see behind them, they're on a visit to the dam site. This is the temporary construction trestle used to haul the concrete to where the dam was under construction. This third gentleman in the front row, that is Antoine Pierre Borel. And when I grew up in San Mateo, I attended A.P. Borel Junior High School, named after this gentleman. And again, small world, I discovered years later that he was the great-grandfather of my best friend in college, my undergraduate days. It is indeed a small world. This is called, of course, the Gilded Age. These were the movers and shakers of San Francisco economically and socially. Of course, there was no income tax in those days. So what you earned, you got to keep. Schuessler was concerned about possible cracking of the concrete. He must have studied concrete design a little bit in his college days. And so he was concerned about cracking due to shrinkage and heat buildup during the curing process. And his innovative solution cast the concrete into interlocking, irregularly shaped blocks in layers no more than 3 to 4 inches thick, and to eliminate voids. Cover the blocks with boards to keep wet for several days to help with the curing. And this is a schematic of how the dam went together. It was like a large Lego set of interlocking blocks. When you visit the dam today, you're looking down on the top of this, and that's exactly the view you get today. A couple of sheets of plans showing this have survived to the present day, and of course they're all hand drafted. But look at all the angles and interlocks, and that's exactly the way it was constructed. This is the burned out shell of the Spring Valley Water Company San Francisco office in May 1906, a month after the earthquake and fire. All the company business records were destroyed in the fire, and a lot of the engineering records as well. And at this point, the story about the construction of the dam may have come to an end, except Spring Valley had a very strong interest in recording their work. They knew they were doing precedent-setting things. And so they had a staff photographer document using glass plate negatives the construction of the dam, and a treasure trove of these original glass plate negatives were rediscovered by Mike Hausch, the archivist for what's now the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, the successor to the Spring Valley Water Company. And he found these about 10 years ago and had them all made into positives and digitally scanned in high resolution. And since they're glass plates, they're not pixelated, and they can be enlarged infinitely. Here's the backside view of the same building. I would have loved to have found some bills of lading for the shipment of the Portland cement to the dam site, but none exist, unfortunately. This is the cover sheet for the plans for the dam, the year the dam was completed, 1890. And you can see it is an arch dam, but it is primarily a gravity dam, gravity structure. It's the mass of concrete that holds it in place. I call your attention to the key section right here in the cursor. These are all innovations that Schuessler came up with because he just had an intuition, I guess. There were no guidebooks, there were no standards available to him. He had to figure it out as he was going, but he obviously did a brilliant job. Here's a close-up of these drawings. Here's the keyway excavated down into bedrock. That is exactly how the dam was built. They originally thought they would complete it to about elevation, right about here, elevation 130, and that would be sufficient. For reasons that become obvious in a minute, they went all the way up to elevation 145, which is the height the dam is to this day. Construction began in 1886, clearing the dam site, and Schuessler, again, had very specific directions to his people, to the laborers, no explosives to use. He did not want to risk cracking bedrock. He wanted to maintain that tight to avoid leakage in the dam. You can see here they are working by hand, clearing and grubbing. It took them a year to prepare the dam site for receiving concrete. Here's concrete mixed formula that Schuessler came up with. 2 barrels of washed sand, 1 barrel of Portland cement, exactly 6.5 barrels of clean crushed rock, mixed thoroughly and cast within 15 minutes. They had production rates approaching 1,000 cubic yards, not per hour, but per day during the peak work periods. This is the mixing plant on site that he designed from scratch. And notice he had two, I think there were a total of 4 mixers, and they're cubes, steam powered. And we believe that he utilized the barrel staves from the watertight barrels that were used to ship the Portland cement as the hog fuel to fire the boilers. And you see these young gentlemen here with their boater hats on site, and laborers wondering, what are these guys doing standing out here in the way? This is undoubtedly a foreman overviewing things. So that was the mixing plant. They used mining carts to transport the wet concrete to the point where they needed it. Schuessler installed a series of 12-inch diameter riveted wrought iron pipes, vertical pipes, tremie pipes, we would call them today. And they would deliver the wet concrete to where they were pouring. They were set up to work their way back and forth across the face of the dam and gradually build it up. I received this slide from Paul Giroux, who used to work for Kiewit Corporation. He's now a retired consultant. And this is from about 10, 12 years ago when Kiewit was doing the dam spillway work. Notice how nice the quality. This is the original concrete work. The paste thoroughly encases all the rock fragments, a good variety of sizing of rock fragments. This is what I would call modern concrete. And I asked him, did they do any strength testing of it? He couldn't recall, but he guessed it was probably in the 3,500 pounds per square inch range. This dam is inspected every 2 years by the state of California, Division of Safety of Dams. It always is passed with high marks. Schuessler not only designed the dam, he designed the outlet works and the valving. You couldn't order valves like this out of a catalog. You have to design and build them. We do know that before he left Germany, he spent some time as an apprentice in a foundry, and he came up with his own design for a high-pressure wrought iron pipe. And the characteristic thing about his is he had a double row of rivets as opposed to the single row that was considered standard in those days. So his pipe was capable of withstanding higher pressures than anybody else's. Dam site at the peak of construction, 1887, 1888, had a workforce of about 1,000. Here you can see the planks covering the wet concrete areas to shade them from the California sun. Here's the trestle. The mixing plant is just off the left edge of the picture here. Excellent photograph here. Here's a slightly later vintage. This is out in the middle of the boondocks of San Mateo, a very rural area at the time. And so they had to provide housing, meals for the workforce of about 1,000 men. That's the way you built things in those days. I love this picture. Here you can see, this exactly shows plans of construction and the layers. It looks like they're about 6 or 8 inches thick in this view. And I love this fellow right here, this laborer. He's looking right into the lens of the camera at the exact moment that the photographer squeezed the bulb and created the image. And notice there's no safety equipment, of course, no hard hats, no safety shoes, all hand labor, not even wearing any gloves. Guess that was okay. It was good work, as you can get it. Here's another view. Here's a foreman climbing up a ladder, but you can see it was just built up in a big layer cake fashion. Schuessler was very intent that if there were any rock pockets, the crew here looks like they may be cleaning up rock pocket here. They would chip them out and make it all firm, ready for the next pour. Here you can see they're spraying with water to keep the concrete moist for the initial curing and cleaning it very carefully. Again, it's all set up with some timber beams here to create a shaded environment to keep the harsh sunlight off the fresh concrete. And here's Mr. Schuessler visiting the dam site. At a later stage, they're nearing the top of the dam. You can see this pattern of joints to this day. Here's the parapet wall. That's the ultimate height of the dam right behind him. He was a hands-on manager, but he recruited and hired good people. There were very few professional engineers available in California in those days, but he trained a number of them. They thought they'd complete the dam to about 130 feet, but the December-January period of 1890 was the wettest winter on record, and they had uncontrolled spill over the top of the dam, which had just been completed a couple of months before that. And I'm sure the people in San Mateo downstream must have been very concerned, is the dam going to fail or not? Well, no, the dam held up just fine, thank you. But they realized that they needed a taller dam. And so the board approved adding 15 additional feet to complete it to the full design height we have today, 145 feet. This is the original county road that went over the top of the dam. Here's another shot of Schuessler at the dam, at the completion of the dam in 1890. This is his proud baby. It looks like he's sitting in the middle of the spillway section. Quantities of materials used, and these are from the records that Schuessler, he did an after-action report to his board, and these are the numbers that did survive. 194,550 barrels of Portland cement. Well, divide that by how many barrels could you squeeze into a sailing ship in the 1880s, and that'll give you the number of voyages that was required to deliver that to San Francisco. I'm guessing maybe 30, maybe more voyages. 389,100 barrels of washed sand, which came locally from North Beach. And of course, it would have been have salt in it from being next to the ocean, but they washed it to wash the salts out. Crushed rock, exact quantity was unknown. The total volume of concrete is known. It's 157,200 cubic yards. That must have been an astronomical number in those days. Typical work day was 10 hours. The work week was 6 days a week. And in Schuessler's report, the cost of materials and labor in $1,890, $2,192,000. That, if you just apply in normal inflation, that'd be approximately $80 million in 2024 dollars. But of course, you couldn't build this dam for $500 million today. It's interesting to look at the cost of labor that was in Schuessler's final report to the board. Project engineers, 60 cents an hour, same as a foreman. Blacksmiths were considered skilled tradesmen. They got 50 cents an hour. Blacksmith helper, a little lower. The laborers, 31.25 cents per hour, which was a living wage in those days. Amazing. And here's some of the workers from Spring Valley Water Company looking very proud what they'd accomplished their work. This is from 1890. Big, healthy men. Life was cheap in those days, and having a good job, a good paying job was highly prized. And I'm sure all these laborers appreciated the work that the Spring Valley offered them. Well, how did they pay for the dam? Well, they issued bonds. I have a copy of the certificate at home, and you read through the fine print. They were redeemable in gold. That's right, gold, which was, of course, California. The gold rush was over by this time, but they're still mining a lot of gold, hard rock mining in the Sierra Nevada foothills. And gold was $16 an ounce in those days. It's what, $2,400 or so an ounce today. But these were like gold certificates. Of course, the owners of the Spring Valley Water Company were all stockholders as well. That's how they paid for them. This is an interesting highlight. In 1895, ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, hosted the annual convention in San Francisco. Mr. Schuessler was prevailed upon to lead a field trip to the dam site. He was not yet a member of ASCE, but he was certainly proud of his creation. And this is the Surreys with the fringe on top on the field trip on that day in 1895. Quite a remarkable photograph from California history. Let's talk a little bit now about the nomination of the dam as an ASC National Historic Landmark. The criteria are pretty clear and kind of obvious. The project must be judged to be of national historic civil engineering significance. Well, Crystal Springs was the first mass concrete dam in the world, as we now understand it. It must represent a significant facet of civil engineering history. Well, we certainly must have some special uniqueness, the first of its kind, etc. Well, that's the same thing here. The plaque that we're going to place for public view, and it must be at least 50 years old. Well, Crystal Springs was way more than that, and must have room for mounting of a 12 by 18-inch bronze plaque. I'll show you that plaque in just a moment. And the owner of the dam, which is in this case the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, has to provide a letter of support. And their only concern when I saw the letter out from them was that they wanted to make sure that achieving this status, which they were in favor of, would not encumber their ability to further update and maintain the dam going forward. And I assured them that, yes, would have no effect like that. And so on December 6th of 2023, there's yours truly introducing our president-elect. Feniosky Peñamora. In politics, water is king in California. It always has been. And I'm standing on top of the dam. There's a state highway, Highway 123, runs right there. And they just preemptively closed the road, closed the state highway. They told the Caltrans, the state transportation agency, we're closing the road for this presentation. And Caltrans said, well, okay. It might have helped that the current governor of California used to be the mayor of San Francisco. But anyway, here's Feniosky making his remarks about the significance of the dam. It looked like it was going to rain that day, but the sun came out just as Feniosky approached the podium. That was a good omen. And here we are with the plaque, which is now on display on a new plinth on the dam face. Here's the Board of Commissioners for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. Here's me, here's Feniosky. He's just a little shorter than me. And the president of the San Francisco section, Remy. Here's what the plaque looks like. It's a lovely plaque. They're expensive. They're about $2,200 a piece now. Here's what the reservoir looks like on the day we dedicated the plaque. It's a lovely spot. And since Spring Valley purchased all the watershed land, there's no encroachments on it, and the water quality is excellent. Most of the water here today, other than what runs off from the 23,000 acre watershed, is imported by the Hetch Hetchy project from the Sierra Nevada. And it is, to this day, the main water supply of the city and county of San Francisco. Special thanks to Mike Hausch, the historian archivist for SFPUC, and Mr. Paul Giroux, a distinguished member of ASCE, who provided his insights and the slide of the concrete coring sample. And with that, Gordon, I'll turn it back to you if you want to MC any questions from the audience.
Many thanks, Larry. Yes, indeed. And yeah, well done. It was obviously a big tragedy that the paper records of the dam were lost in the fire of the Spring Valley. But what a consolation that these glass plate negatives were recovered and have survived to the present day.
And those were found in San Bruno, which was the field office for originally Spring Valley Water Company, in an old building attic. And they probably stood there in boxes undisturbed for 50 years or more.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's such a great consolation prize for not having the paper records. And you can really see the human endeavour to build the dam. And it's just, they're so clear and sharp as well. What a brilliant
the quality
photographic
is excellent.
Now, folks, I hope you do have questions. Please use the Q&A button on the Zoom interface. Here's one about the San Andreas Fault. Does it run through the reservoir, through the dam? How did it survive the earthquake? Do we know?
It does. It runs. It's 1,100 feet west of the dam. 1,100 feet. That's nothing. And again, its existence was unknown. Although Schuessler was obviously, I think, the great engineers. I'm reading the biography of Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, and he was not the greatest technician, but he was highly intuitive. And I'm sure Hermann Schuessler also shared a high degree of intuition. He traversed the watershed many times on horseback. He might have had an inkling there's something strange here, but he had no special knowledge or training about the existence of the fault until 1895. This is a section of the fault that moved in 1906, and again, in 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake. There was some seshing, a movement of water in the reservoir in 1906, and there's anecdotal evidence that there was some waves that splashed over the top of the dam, but they did not damage the roadway. It's survived totally intact. And it is, like I say, it's inspected every 2 years by the California Division of Safety of Dams, and it's always gotten highest marks.
Yeah. Brilliant. And that was a question from Alec Fry. From Nigel, do you know the volume of water retained by the dam?
You know, I should know that. I don't have that in mind. I think it's on the order of about 60,000 acre feet.
And there's an observation from Nigel that the shape of the hull of the training tall ship of the Omani Navy is based on the hull of the Cutty Sark.
And of course, the Cutty Sark was a hybrid itself. It was one of the last of the true clipper ships, and it had wrought iron ribs instead of timbers, wooden timbers.
Indeed.
So that created more capacity in the hull to transport goods.
Yeah, indeed. Keep an eye out on how the Australians are doing with refurbishing the city of Adelaide. That used to sit in Glasgow as a hull, and it was taken back to Australia. where it used to ply. So that might be a survivor yet to be refurbished.
Well, there is a similar looking ship on public display in San Francisco. It's called the Balclutha. It is a wrought iron hull, riveted hull, but it sure looks like the Cutty Sark in plan and performance.
Jim's asking for a reminder of the concrete strength today from the extracted core. You did mention that, Larry, I think, but can you remember?
They did not run any crush tests on the core. They just were looking for competence and how well the concrete paste was encasing the aggregate. Paul Giroux, who certainly should know, estimated it's about 3,500 PSI concrete, which is standard bread and butter concrete for most, where they don't require high strength concrete to this day.
Yeah.
And that's a tribute to the mixed design that Schuessler came up with.
Absolutely. And
again,
the
he
success.
had no guidebooks to guide him in this. He just knew what he knew.
Yeah. And the success of transporting it from the UK in barrels, the cement, anyway, is just amazing. Candice Lukashevich, was there any loss of life in constructing the dam?
No records of any loss of life. And given the close control that Schuessler had directly with his foreman, and there'd be a large squad of foremen dedicated to a project like this, I think they probably kept a hammer on people, and there's no records of any serious injuries or loss of life. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. But again, those kind of paper records did not survive to the present day.
Yes, so perhaps more research maybe to be absolutely sure. What's the design life service left for the dam? That's a tough question. Is there any major cracking or repair carried out so far?
I have asked a version of that question of both SFPUC and the local engineer for the California Division of Safety of Dams. And they say, as long as it passes the biennial safety inspection, the dam is good to go. Could easily go another 100 years. It's what, 130 plus years old now. I've done a lot of design concrete work in my career. Every dam leaks. Every concrete dam leaks. Does it leak uncontrollably? This one? No. The leakage is considered de minimis and not of any structural concern. When you stand on top of the dam, look down on the face, you'll see a few little weeds and ferns growing on the downstream face, but it looks very contemporary, overall very, very clean and competent. There's no obvious rock pockets, as I'm sure Schuessler would not have allowed that to happen.
Indeed. And design life really is a bit of a construct, really. It's a convenience. The real actual useful longevity of anything, bridge or dam, depends on how well it's maintained, how well it's inspected, and on inspection, how it's deemed to.
Well, I just would point out that the Pantheon in Rome was built in the year 126 AD. It's still standing to this day. And that is partially reinforced. There's some iron chains that are embedded in the walls of that. But it's a concrete structure. It's 1,800 years old.
Indeed. Question here, Larry, from David. Can the scanned plates be viewed by the public? Are they in the public domain in an archive? And if we can have a link to those, he'd be interested.
I will check. That's a very good question. I believe they are available. There must be an archive page on the SFPUC website, and that's where they would be resident, unless some of them may be on the California Historical Society. They're in Sacramento. I'll check. That's a good question. I'll try and get a more detailed answer. They should be. Mike Hausch, the archivist for SFPUC, is very proud of the collection he very just serendipitously encountered.
Garth Wilson, what was the highest number of labour technicians working during the construction period? What did the workforce peak at? Do you know, Larry?
Yes, I think I mentioned that in my presentation, about 1,000. And they were all resident on site in bunkhouses and mess halls that had to be built for that purpose. Because it was out in the boondocks, there's no other towns nearby. And you either walked or rode on a horse to get there.
Yeah. Great. Oh, question from Dennis Beaulieu. Was a watertight membrane used to prevent water from going through the dam? Oh, I don't know how you'd get one of those in those days. Puddled clay, maybe.
As brilliant as Schuessler was, in my estimation, I don't think he anticipated the need for a membrane. I think the closest thing to it was the great care he used in preparation of the dam site. requiring only hand tools to clear and grub and remove overburden materials, no explosives. I heard anecdotally also that he had crews out there with brooms brushing the exposed rock face before the first concrete was placed. So no membrane as we would understand it today. And nothing shows up on the limited number of plan sheets that we have.
No, materials science being as it was in the 1890s, probably tough to deliver anyway. Mark Rowan asks, is it known how the existing river water flow was accommodated during construction?
One of the construction photos indicates the low-level outlet, and that was the first thing that was constructed, and they just diverted stream flow. And this is a creek, San Mateo Creek, and in that climate, in a typical year, you'll have 6 months of no rainfall at all. It's a classic Mediterranean climate. You have to be concerned about winter flows. I'm sure Schuessler probably pushed the initial concrete work as quickly as they could to build up the dam to get it above the amount of annual runoff that would happen in a normal year. It was not overtopped during construction, except at the very end in January of 1890, when they thought they had full height of 130 feet, and they ended up going in the last 15 feet beyond that.
Great. Thanks, Larry. Dave Ennis asked, any indication of the number of individual block shapes that were designed and used?
It's in the thousands. I've asked that question. We don't have a complete set of as-built plans for the dam, but the sheets that we do have at the mid-height, there's over 100 polygons exposed that you count up, and then you multiply that by the number of layers. It's in the 4,000 or 5,000, I'm sure. Each one, incidentally, was formed by hand by carpenters. That's why carpenters were considered a skilled trade on this job.
Someone's wishing me a happy belated Robbie Burns Day. You're about 4 days late only. That's fine, but yeah, you can still have a whiskey after the the seminar tonight.
I've seen his statue in Edinburgh.
Yes. Next one from Matthew's iPhone. How were the dam construction tools, such as custom mixers, pipes, etc., how were they repurposed? Were they repurposed after the dam was completed? Do we know?
We have no information on that. I would imagine, knowing Schuessler was a thrifty fellow, he probably would have deconstructed as much of that as possible and hauled it off to be reused later. I do know the ironworks in San Francisco, Marine Ironworks, where all these things were fabricated, a few years later, in the 1890s, built the battleship Oregon, which figured prominently in the Spanish-American War of 1898. It steamed from Bremerton, Washington, around South America into Santiago Harbor in Cuba, just in time to bombard the Spanish fleet in 1898. That was a steel hull, so I would suspect they probably would take some of this surplus iron and melt it down and make it into steel.
Howard Snowden asks a question, has there been any sign of AAR, alkali aggregate reaction, or alkali silica reaction, sometimes called? Larry, do you know?
Negative. Yeah, I've asked about that, and it's non-reactive. It's, as you can see from the cylinder I showed, that's basalt bedrock, and of course that's non-reactive.
Tim Heisler, do you think the dam would be built, couldn't be built to current codes and standards? Do you think it would be assessed and meet current codes and standards? I guess we'll turn the question a little bit.
I would say the dam obviously has been grandfathered in, and the only operable thing that the state of California is concerned about is public health and safety. That's how they would evaluate the safety of the dam, and I think there's any obvious cracking, that'd be the first indication that there's serious problems. And there's minor movement on the San Andreas Fault all the time to relieve stresses.
This has been an interesting webinar, and thank you very much for a lovely webinar. We'll close things down now, and we'll see people at the end of March.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, folks.
The new transatlantic cable webinars are coordinated by a tripartite ad hoc committee that includes the individuals listed here.